I know down to the decent how much it costs to cross the river of death. Sharon doesn't do discounts. He's an asshole like that. I wasn't buried with money, not that uncommon these days. Sharon understands that, and he's got to make a living like everyone else. So he adapted, he changed it up. He still charges the same, but now he takes his tribute in jewelry, fine clothes, dress shoes, all the accoutrements of luxury that are given to the respected dead. I was buried in a shallow grave by a man I don't remember the name of. He told me, but I've forgotten it over the last century. I do remember that he was crying when he killed me. Regret maybe. I don't care for his regrets. It's got a bitter taste to it. He buried me naked. No bits and baubles to pay for my passage over the river. I was not of the respected dead. I was nobody, and nobody remembered me. When I woke up in the afterlife, I still had the open wounds of his knife, although they didn't hurt or bleed. I spent most of my first days trapped here huddled into myself, shaking with fear and hiding in denial. There are other abandoned souls like me sometimes, but they always leave quickly. There was a Nigerian woman who died of starvation, stuck in a cave. But a couple of days after she arrived, she got smart and traded her beautiful hair for a trip across. My hair is dull and unkept, not nearly valuable enough. Then a man with eyes the color of sea glass who tried to swim across by himself. He stepped past the line of silver stakes that kept the souls of the river contained within it, and the dam tore him to shreds instantly. I've got a piece of his arm hidden somewhere. I talk to it sometimes. There must be other rivers, other Sharons, because there are never more souls to cross that can fit in the boat. Maybe those other rivers look like the staircase of heaven or the cycle of reincarnation, and I just got unlucky enough to end up with the only gates to the afterlife that require payment. I don't know if this message is going to go through. Sharon gets a day off once every 10 years, and this decade he went up to the overworld, teleporting there by using the Mickey Mouse watch, which he always wears wrapped around his wrist. He spun the little knob once, twice, and then he shimmered into nothing. He brought back a computer for me and set up a Wi-Fi router. It's sitting huddled in the black sand, out of place, surrounded by the wastelands of rocks and dead trees of the underworld. On that same day, he got strings of little pink LEDs and wrapped them around his dog. It's always cast in fading twilight there, and the lights shone like a beacon. He told me that he was sorry he couldn't do anything else to help me. He was the ferryman, and he was bound by his nature. I think it might be nice to share my stories though. It's taken me hours to figure out how all the buttons work. It's strange how quickly technology advances. Sharon has certainly advanced with it. He's got a smartphone now. He plays Geometry Dash in the mindless minutes or decades spent waiting for more souls to ferry. There was a chunk of time when he wore things called Google glasses. Those make you look ugly, I told him.
You just don't understand fashion.
He responded. I tried to steal Sharon's boat once upon a time. I waited until he was distracted with something he had called a Game Boy. Then I snuck up behind him and struck him in the head with a branch which I'd snapped from one of the shriveled trees that lined the banks. He'd gone down, easy as anything, immortal, but just as fragile as my skin was when it parted under my murderer's knife. He dropped the oar when I hit him, and it fell into the river, then sunk away into the depths. So I paddled with my hands. I took up the water in my palms and pushed it behind me while the damned gripped my fingers, trying desperately to pull me in. It was a sacrifice bend, knees pressing indents into the bottom of the boat, my arms splayed out to either side. I pressed prayers into the water with my bare hands and didn't look away from the shoreline, the shore that would finally take me from this awful limbo. I didn't care where I went after. I was just tired of the endless waiting, but the land never drew closer. I put all my strength into it, really buckled down and did the work, but I was just drifting in place, alone and conquered by the river. Sharon came to claim his ferry when he woke up. Turned out he had a spare boat, surprise surprise. He commanded the boats together and wrapped one big hand around my throat. He held me up over the river while I clawed at his wrist with my fingernail.
I should really just drop you in.
I choked because, unfortunately, the dead can still feel pain, trying to beg him for mercy with my eyes. I remembered what happened to the people who had tried to swim across, and I was terrified of ending up like them. He sighed, then tossed me in the bag like a sack of flour and took me back to the shore. It makes sense in retrospect. He never would have killed me. He got lonely as well. Another time, I tried to steal his watch. He'd learned from the boat incident and was always careful to keep an eye on me when I was around. So I had to wait until his guard was down. I wrapped my fingers around the knob and spun it like I'd seen Sharon do, filled with the hope for the first time in decades. Nothing happened. I sobbed once and kept spinning the knob. Sharon stood with his hands in his pockets, pity in his eyes.
I'm the ferryman. It only works for me.
I screamed at him, wordless, and threw the watch into the sand. I gathered stories from the souls passing through, just as a way to pass the time. Fred swirled a small intestine around his finger, thoughtfully, like a piece of hair. He'd been killed by a bear in Yosemite, a freak accident, he said. They were usually so timid. His gut had been torn open by its teeth, and he had to keep a hand pressed over his stomach at all times to keep his organs on the inside. He had worked at the morgue before and told me the macabre stories of death, about Take de Noir, Las Sequoias, and gases escaping that made it look like the victim was still alive. That's what I'd call out to the other guys. I've got his body in that bag that's starting to breathe again. Wanna see? Fred said. And of course, the answer was always yes. Fred decomposed at the bottom of a trench. He had nothing to trade for a trip either. During his third year, he remarked on the silver stakes driven into the banks of the river, the only things binding the damned. Then he stepped over them and tried to swim to the river. When the remnants of his body finally washed up on shore, they practically crumbled to dust beneath my fingers. Vanessa cracked her head open when she fell down the stairs in her house. I can see her brain tissue because of the carved indent at the back of her head. She had a necklace that she'd been buried with, but she didn't want to get on the boat, and Sharon didn't force her. She sat beside me for days and mumbled to herself. "You should get on the boat, Vanessa," I said to her. She didn't respond, but when I guided her towards the dock, she didn't resist. Sharon pulled the necklace from her unresisting fingers, stuck it into his money pouch, and got her settled on one of the benches. As he pushed off from the dock with his paddle, she turned to me, her eyes suddenly clear. "Everything is already dead here. Everything except the bugs who stick their heads out of the ground. They gossip. I hear them when they run under my fingers and burrow under my nails," she told me. I just smiled and nodded. Vanessa seemed to like it when I smiled. We got an earthquake a couple of weeks after Vanessa left. They happened sometimes. I had no idea why, and if Sharon knew, he wasn't telling for sure. He was trying to pull his boat out of the wild waves of the river before it got bashed against the dock, and only somewhat succeeding. Despite most of my attention being occupied by laughing at him, my eyes were drawn to something shifting down the river. I took a moment to process what I was seeing, and then I was screaming for Sharon. A crack was forming in the ground, running along the bank and separating out of a piece of land from the rest. It looked like the river was taking a handful of ground and pulling it into the water.
"The stakes."
Sharon whispered suddenly right beside me. With a jolt of fear, I realized he was right. There was a glint of silver just above the waterline. As the stakes fell into the river along with the ground they were attached to. The stakes fell into the river with a sound like a fire starting. There was a pause, a moment of calm, and then the damned, constantly testing the edges of their prison, found the crack in the wall. They swarmed up onto the bank, dripping wet and climbing over each other in their eagerness to get to me and Sharon.
"Run!"
He yelled, pushing me behind him. He twisted the knob of his watch and half turned and raised his hands in front of him. The air glimmered with red, and then the advancing waves of the damned hit an invisible wall. They screamed as one, raking their claws along the barrier. Sharon was sweating in seconds, his hands trembling. I ran for the dock, where I knew Sharon kept emergency stakes. I fell to my knees in the sand beside his tool chest and gathered up a handful, as well as a hammer. When I got to my feet, I could see that his shield was failing. A claw slipped through, or at the end of a tail. A damned managed to fit its entire upper body through the barrier before Sharon managed to push it back. We didn't have much time. He saw me coming, the silver in my hand. He nodded in grim understanding. He turned the knob another degree and took a step forward, pushing the shield and the damned with him. I stayed beside him, holding onto his arm while he stumbled. I tried not to look at the damned. I was barely holding on to my courage without the sight of them literally foaming at the mouth as they tried to get at me. We reached the bank. The damned were being pushed back into the water, yowling the whole way. I gripped the stake and drove it against the hard rock above the water, using all my strength to hammer it in. One of the damned got through the shield, swiping out for me with its claws. I flinched back, dodging most of it. but it still managed to score a line across my thigh. It leapt for me, and I swung the hammer against its skull, hitting it out of the air. It landed hard and kept twitching, trying to get back up. I stepped over it, moving awkwardly from the cut it had put in my leg, and smashed it to pieces until it stopped being able to move. It was still conscious technically. I couldn't kill something that was already dead, but its body was so torn to pieces that it couldn't make its limbs move. That was for Fred, I told its shattered remains.
Hurry up.
Sharon said through gritted teeth. He had fallen onto his knees at some points, and the barrier was sputtering. I moved to the next spot, drove a stake in, then the next. The stakes couldn't be more than 3 meters apart. They had originally been spaced at exactly that distance, but I didn't have time to be more exact and just hoped that they were close enough. With one stake left, Sharon's barrier fell and he slumped to the ground. Too damned climbed back out of the river before I could get a stake in place. I was holding Silver and had bits of their defeated companion in my hair, so they ignored me completely and went for the easier prey, Sharon. He could barely keep his eyes open, but he made a slicing motion with 2 fingers, laboriously slow, and one of the dam collapsed with its head separated from its body. The other damned, running inhumanely fast, blurred right over the viscera, now staining the sand, and tore Sharon's throat open with its claws. If that had happened to me, I would probably have been fine. It would have hurt like hell for sure, but I would still exist. I didn't need my blood or even my skin. It was just a container to house my soul. Sharon wasn't like me. He was the ferryman, sure, but he also went back above the ground once a decade on his holiday and was technically still a living mortal himself. He could be permanently hurt and he could die. At least it was quick. He probably didn't suffer. The damned sunk its teeth into his chest, shaking him like a dog with a favorite toy. I limped towards it, tears in my eyes and my hammer thumping against my leg with every step. The damned eyed me and my hammer apprehensively, huddling over Sharon's body with its teeth still stuck into him. Sharon's wrists played out on the sand behind the damned, starting to glow. Squinting, I could see that the light was coming from the watch. On instinct, I held out my hands, and the watch quivered into place, then flew past the damned, straight at me. It thumped against my forehead, leaving a welt, and fell into my hand. The damned growled at me, dragging Sharon's body with it as it retreated. I strapped on the watch, and there was a burst of light, a sense of warmth. This time, when I turned the knob, the results were explosive. The damned burst into flames, and its squealing and helpless squirms did nothing but entice the fire faster. After, when Sharon's corpse had been covered until I figured out what to do with him, and I had double and triple checked that the stakes would hold, I realized something. The ferryman was dead. I had the watch. There was nothing stopping me from rowing across the river, or even teleporting to the surface and trying to find my way back into the living. I started a fire while I thought about it, using the branches of the dead trees and lighting it with the last smoldering ashes of the dam that I killed Sharon. By the time the fire had burned down, I had my answer. I gathered Sharon's body up into my arms and turned the knob, I hadn't seen the sun in so long. It was as beautiful as I remembered. It took a little bit of tinkering, but eventually I figured out the controls of the watch. I laid my hand over Sharon's eyes and he crumbled into dust. The dust was blown away by the wind. Then I went back to the underworld. The ferryman was dead. I had the watch. Sharon was bound by tradition, by the stories that held him rigidly in place as a stern purveyor who only allowed paying customer. People expected him to ask for payment, and belief is a powerful thing in the underworld. But I was completely unimportant, a true nobody. There was nothing stopping me from taking anyone across the river who wanted to go. I could make sure that no one that came to my afterlife was ever left alone on the banks again.